your headphones in there?
I think so, yeah. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Give me 1 second.
Okay.
I'm gonna get Sarah to check me.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay, good. So how were your holidays?
Pretty mellow. How about yours?
They were good. Had my family to Austin, so I cooked for.
You're in Austin.
Yeah,
It's a great city.
yeah, I like it.
Been there on book tours.
Yeah, you went to Book People, or?
Oh my God, I don't even remember. I do remember the Driscoll Hotel, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, I used to work at the Texas Book Festival, and we were right next door to the Driscoll. So,
what is it like during South by Southwest? Is it just?
It's like a good time to be in New York. It's like insane. And the book festival office is downtown. I mean, Kirkus is way out by the airport, so we're not really affected. But I mean, it's fun, and I have to say, in their defense, I mean, and I used to write for South by Southwest Film,
Right.
but they do try really hard to get, low-cost tickets or free tickets to Austinites, but it kind of takes over the entire city. So,
That's what I've heard.
yeah. Well, hey, congrats with this. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll just talk for about 10 minutes and just use the best 3 or so minutes here.
Okay.
And I'll do that radio thing where I'm not going to interrupt you.
Okay. How many questions do you have? I'm just trying to gauge the length of my answers.
I just have about 5.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll just, if we don't get to some of them, it's fine.
Okay.
So, yeah. But, one of the things that interested me the most about this book, and then I saw it sort of, I guess, confirmed in the press notes that you wrote, is that, with each of your novels, you try to drop fictional characters into real life situations.
Right.
But, I would actually say you go a little bit further than that. And I think that it's really interesting what you do, because a lot of writers who use actual events, I guess as sort of taking off points or inspiration for their novels, they don't use the actual people who made the news.
Right.
But, you have Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and some other people. And other writers may not use real people for legal reasons or other reasons that I don't really know. But tell me about that decision to use those real people, because I like it, and it gives the novel this like immediacy that's really nice.
That's part of the goal, that sort of immediacy and realism. Realism is super important to me in everything I write. Primarily, I guess, because since I'm writing thrillers, I think the things that are most thrilling, the most frightening, are the ones that when we read them, we feel like, oh my God, this could really be happening. And since The God's Eye View is a story about metastasized government surveillance, I don't know how you could deal with that topic if you don't deal with without some of the major players in journalism and whistleblowing involved in that topic. And of course, that would be Edward Snowden on the whistleblowing side, and people like Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras and Ellen McCaskill of The Guardian on the journalist side. So for realism, if for nothing else, I think you just have to deal with the historical facts as they present themselves today. I think some novelists are probably reluctant to go too far down that path because they're afraid events will change. So for example, if you were writing a novel about Al-Qaeda in 2010, 2011, you might have been really concerned that if you spent too much time talking about, say, the hunt for Osama bin Laden, that maybe the government would have tracked him down and killed him by the time the novel came out, and then the novel would feel dated. And that's a legitimate concern. It's something novelists have to watch out for. But I tend, if I'm having to make a decision there, I tend to take my chances and go for the realism and the thrills rather than the, I don't want to run afoul of what might happen in the future.
Right. And so I've read about your, kind of, I guess, misgivings about traditional publishing, and I totally understand those. Tell me about why you went with Amazon. Is it a quicker process? Like you were referencing this lag in time between creation of the book and until it reaches readers. Is it quicker with Amazon, or?
In general, that's been my experience, but the speed is only part of it. And before I go any further, I just want to say this, because a lot of authors, maybe even most authors these days, are trying to make up their minds about what is the best route of publishing for them. And it's been interesting for me, as someone who talks about this stuff a lot, writes about it a lot. I'm frequently positioned as somehow a fan of self-publishing, a proponent of self-publishing, that kind of thing. And the nomenclature isn't really accurate. What I'm a fan of, what I'm a proponent of, is choice in publishing. As for how any individual author might exercise that choice for him or herself, I don't know. I don't know who, unless I know a person very well, unless I know that person's goals and talents, aspirations, business objectives, all these sorts of things. It's pretty hard for me to have an opinion about how that person will derive the greatest fulfillment, what publishing route will derive for that person the greatest possible fulfillment. So on an individual level, I don't have an opinion about how people should publish. Should they go the legacy route, self-publishing, Amazon publishing, which I think of as a kind of hybrid between the legacy route and self-publishing? It depends on a lot of things. Just quickly in this regard, for anyone who's watching this and trying to decide for himself or herself, one thing you want to ask right off the bat is, what do you expect your paper sales to be versus your digital sales? If your sales skew heavily toward paper, then probably the traditional, the legacy route is going to make the most sense for you, because self-publishing is just not a particularly strong paper play. We could talk a lot about why and how that's changing, but certainly for now, most of your sales on the self-publishing side, you can expect to be digital. Likewise for Amazon. Amazon's very strong with digital distribution, digital marketing, but not as strong in paper. So if you're really a big paper play, that's going to skew toward the legacy route. That makes sense. On the other hand, if you're like me and over time you've seen your sales skew more and more from paper to digital, then you're going to start thinking, well, does the legacy route really make sense for me? Paper is where they're really strong. In the other areas, they can't offer me very much at all. And then there are other areas of concern, like time to market. That's also important to me. Control over business decisions, also important to me. I've had publishers saddle some of my books with the most god-awful covers that you can imagine. I mean, really excrementiously bad covers. And anyone who's curious about wants to go deeper on these topics, go to my website, barryeisler.com. There's a link called For Writers, and within that is something called Resources for Indie Writers. Everything that I've learned the hard way in, at this point, about 14 or 15 years in this business, I've tried to distill into a number of articles and essays and keynotes and that sort of thing that you can find on my website, all of which go a lot deeper than we can go here. But those are your three basic parameters when you want to think about digital versus paper, and related to that, brick and mortar distribution versus online distribution, time to market, how important is it to you to get the biggest possible royalty on digital sales per unit? If you go the legacy route, you're talking about maybe 17.5%. If you're talking about the Amazon route, you're talking double that. And if you go self-publishing per unit in digital, you'll be making 70%, which is 4 times per unit what you can make on the legacy side. So do the math and figure out, can a legacy publisher make it up for you on volume, so to speak, or make it up for you with paper sales or otherwise. And the third category would be control over business decisions, the title of the book, the cover of the book, all aspects of the packaging and positioning of the book. If you feel pretty confident that you're good at these things and it makes you happy to be in charge of these things, you have a hard time trusting the so-called experts. I know a few people like that. I'm one of them, maybe because of the track record of the so-called experts. And you'll probably be more comfortable being in charge, and that would mean self-publishing, or what is, in my experience, a much more collaborative relationship with a publisher like Amazon, then you're likely to find going with the New York Big Five.
Yeah. You know, you referenced earlier this kind of natural fear that novelists have of, you know, writing something newsy, but not knowing what the future may hold. But
Right.
you actually mentioned in the press notes here that that The God's Eye View is actually kind of you'll read about in the future
Yeah.
what is actually happening in this novel, which seems accurate to me.
Sad but true.
Yeah, is that sort of presaging something that you try to do in each of your thrillers, or is it kind of more unique to this one? Did the timing just work out for this one, or tell me about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Every one of my novels has included speculation, extrapolation based on real world events. And a lot of that speculation and extrapolation has turned out to be accurate. Those sort of forecasts have turned out to be true. And it's not I'm not using the novel as a vehicle for some kind of political forecasts, predictions. It just turns out that way because I'm a news junkie. I read obsessively. I blog more on politics than I should, just given that my day job involves deadlines and the blogging sometimes gets in the way of them. But I'm really interested in a variety of topics. I mean, in no particular order of importance: torture, government transparency and secrecy, the rule of law, civil liberties, metastatic bulk surveillance, and government unaccountability. These are things that concern me greatly, and I read and think about and write about these things a lot. And so naturally, these things that I spend a lot of time on, that occupy a lot of my mind, wind up in the stories that I come up with in my books. If I were just a journalist, I would probably be limiting myself. I didn't mean just a journalist to put journalists down. In fact, I'm a huge fan of good journalists. I mean, if I were a journalist only rather than a novelist, I would probably limit myself to describing as best as I can what we know exists today and its potential implications. But as a novelist, I'm able to go a little bit beyond that. I'm able to consider not just what we know from the news, from whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Thomas Drake, John Kiriakou, Jesslyn Radick, Diane Rourke, so many others, but also from what we know from history, programs like COINTELPRO. And anybody who's watching, if you don't know about COINTELPRO, you really should, because it's just a template for government overreach. And if you think COINTELPRO is limited to a specific time and set of circumstances in American history, you'd have a hard time convincing me that that's the truth. COINTELPRO has much more to do with immutable laws of human nature than it did with any sort of peculiarities of time and circumstance. Anyway, COINTELPRO is spelled like coin, COINTELPRO. Just Google it, find a Wikipedia page, you can learn all about it. It was a program of domestic sabotage and subversion run by the FBI, targeting dissidents, anti-war activists, student groups, the civil rights movement, people that the government decided for various reasons were dangerous. Another one to look up will be Operation Mockingbird. That was a bit of a CIA equivalent aimed at psychological operations against American journalists and other media. So when I look at operations from hopefully the past, like COINTELPRO and Mockingbird, and having some opinions about human nature, as we novelists probably ought to do, and then combining all that with what I read in the news and understand about what's actually going on in the world today, I'm able to come up with concepts like, okay, these are the things we know are the case based on the actions of whistleblowers and journalists. And then based on what I know of history, like COINTELPRO, and what I believe about human nature, what would the government be doing with the kinds of programs that have been revealed so far? What would the government be doing that even someone like Edward Snowden might not have had access to? And then I'll come up with a story that's built around those ideas. And that's really what I'm talking about, is the plot of The God's Eye View. Many times after I've written about something like that, things get reported in the news that turn out to track with what I guess you could call my predictions, my speculations. Things like the growth of video surveillance technology and facial recognition systems. And I was speculating about this stuff when I was working on my second book, A Lonely Resurrection back in 2002. That's when I was writing that book. And this stuff is pervasive now. Probably there's a lot more of it even than we currently understand. Also in that book, I was talking about safety violations at Tokyo Electric and Power, TEPCO. This turns out to have been the company that was cutting all sorts of corners at the Fukushima nuclear reactor that caused so many problems in connection with the tsunami and earthquake of 2011. So at the time, I read about some of TEPCO's safety violations, and I thought, look, if this is what we know about, it's probably the tip of the iceberg. They probably haven't discovered everything. There's going to be a much more pervasive pattern of corruption here than even what's being reported in the news. So, if that's the case, what's the nature, what's the real breadth of the problems we're dealing with? And it turns out, sadly, that I had it pretty well dialed in when we learned about what was really going on at TEPCO in 2011. Hacking a Pacemaker, very first book. I started working on that book, A Clean Kill in Tokyo, in 1993. And I came up with this notion of how you could wirelessly hack a pacemaker. Technology's changed a little bit. At the time, there was no Bluetooth. So my guy, John Rain, was using infrared to wirelessly interrogate this pacemaker and shut it down. Then it turns out many years later, Homeland used that concept in one of their episodes. I've had people write to me and say, hey man, Homeland is ripping you off, which is kind of a nice compliment. The truth is, people can come up with these ideas independently. I'm quite sure of it. I really like the show Homeland, by the way, even though it's a little racist, it's pretty entertaining. Anyway, or if they got the idea from one of my books, then I'm flattered. It doesn't really matter. The point is that this concept then gets introduced in other entertainment venues, and even in Dick Cheney's autobiography and memoir, he revealed that he had instructed his heart doctors to turn off the wireless interrogation function on his pacemaker, lest assassins hack into it and take advantage of it. So these are just things I was thinking about based on the current state of technology. What if you combine different kinds of technology? Could you go even further? And the answer is, yeah, it turns out you can. Assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, I did in my book Fault Line back in 2008. That was reported in the news about, I don't know, a year, maybe 2 years later. Just things that make sense based on my overall understanding of United States government geopolitical goals, programs, and a lot of times if you use your imagination and apply it to what we know based on what's being reported in the news, you can see further than just what's being reported. You can actually see what's coming next, what's going to be reported next.
Yeah. You mentioned Chelsea Manning. You know, I've heard a lot of crazy stories from writers about how they got blurbs from various people. I'm imagining it was not the easiest thing to get a blurb from Chelsea Manning, given that she's in prison. Is that right?
That's right. Well, I could try to make up a crazy story about just how hard it is, but I follow Chelsea Manning on Twitter. I'm a huge fan. I think she's an American hero. Whistleblowers, if you ask me to name my heroes, whistleblowers would be pretty much at the top of the list, along with some really intrepid journalists with a lot of integrity. I mean, I think these people are on the front lines of democracy. If you think about where we are today, the government knows more and more about the people, and the people know less and less about the government. And this asymmetry just keeps getting worse. Government secrecy and corresponding unaccountability has metastasized to a point where you can question whether we're in fact even living in a democracy anymore. It's a totally legitimate question. Federal courts have proved almost useless. They have this slavish devotion to the so-called state secrets doctrine. They don't even want to look into things like torture, mass surveillance. They're very reluctant to interfere with any sort of what they consider to be executive prerogatives, no matter how unconstitutional. And Congress is about as supine as you can imagine. What is left to make us, the people, aware of what the government is doing, often illegally and unconstitutionally, in our names? I would submit that really the last line of defense is whistleblowers, people like Chelsea Manning. So these people are my heroes. Anyway, it's possible that fiction. Yeah, fiction too. Although I don't want to. I mean, I do try to. Obviously, I care a lot about these political issues, and it's satisfying for me to be able to use my fiction to try to help frame the terms of political debate, political conversation. By the way, this is something the right does really well on a tactical level. I mean, hats off. The right has done a tremendous job of framing the issue of torture, for example. into just something of does torture work? That's the big right-wing talk. Can it work is even better. That's the big rightist authoritarian talking point. And the answer is, of course, torture can work. What can't work? I mean, it's like asking, would a flamethrower work against a mosquito in my house? Yes, if you limit your goal to very narrowly just incinerating the mosquito, then fine, a flamethrower can work against a mosquito. But no sensible person would advocate dealing with a mosquito inside the house with a flamethrower. It would be insane. You'd burn down your house. And the analogy works pretty well when we consider torture. But the right has done a good job through fiction, through shows like 24, authors like Brad Thor and Vince Flynn, or in Vince's case, died tragically young. These guys get invited onto shows like Glenn Beck when he had his show, Rush Limbaugh. They do a really nice job of supporting novelists who promote that authoritarian worldview in their novels. The left just needs to start firing back on this kind of stuff. Anyway, so it pleases me to be able to use my books, certainly in the guise of what Graham Greene called entertainments. And these are novels. I'm not like, what's that saying? If you want to send a message, use Western Union. I forget the name of the guy, the movie mogul who said that. But anyway, yeah, if I want to send a message, I'll write a blog post. What I'm doing first and foremost with my novels is, I hope, entertainment. And then hopefully the stories are thrilling, the characters are real, the trade craft is as real as I know, based on 3 years in a covert position with the CIA. The martial arts, the action sequences are based on my own experiences, training at the Kodokan in Tokyo. Everything is as real and thrilling as I can possibly make it. I want you to be on the edge of your seat. Hopefully I succeed in that. But within all that, I also hope that that readers will come away questioning some orthodoxies about which they've been relentlessly propagandized by the establishment media, and maybe looking at the world in a slightly different way. The difference between, one important difference between my efforts in this regard and the efforts of whistleblowers and journalists, but primarily whistleblowers, there's really no risk to a novelist who's doing what I'm doing. I mean, I'm not going to get put in prison for my storylines. It's just, there's no risk. Doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. I think it's the right thing to do. But I certainly wouldn't hold myself out. I would not hold myself up there with people like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Thomas Drake, Bill Binney, and so many others who've taken enormous risks and paid a significant price for their patriotic actions. And again, I think these people are American heroes and should be recognized as such.
Yeah, cool. This is great. Well, thanks. Hope the book does well. And we'll get this up and run it a little bit later this month.
Awesome. Will you let me know when it's up so I can, link to it on social media and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, we'll be happy to.
Awesome. Thank you, Clay. That was fun.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
All right.
Okay, have a good day.
Thanks for enjoying the book. Cheers.
Okay, bye-bye.